The late afternoon sun filtered through the towering windows of Ambrosia restaurant, catching the crystal chandeliers and scattering prismatic light across the marble floors. Tom Hanks paused at the entrance, adjusting the collar of his well-worn navy polo shirt. After a long day of production meetings, he'd chosen comfort over formality, though he was keenly aware of the restaurant's reputation as one of Manhattan's most exclusive dining establishments. A gentle smile played across his face as he took in the elegant scene before him. White-clothed tables dotted the expansive dining room like islands in a sea of luxury. The soft murmur of conversation mingled with the delicate clink of fine china and crystal stemware, creating a symphony of refinement that seemed at odds with his casual attire. Tom ran a hand through his slightly disheveled silver hair, remembering the countless times he'd walked through these doors in tailored suits for business meetings. Today was different. He'd purposely chosen to come as just another person seeking a quiet meal, leaving the trappings of celebrity at the door. The matron's podium stood empty, but the quiet bustle of the restaurant's staff continued around him. A young waitress approached, her steps faltering slightly as she noticed his casual appearance. Tom's smile widened warmly, though something in her expression made him suspect the evening might not go quite as planned. He'd learned long ago that sometimes the most interesting stories began in moments of discomfort. As he stood there, bathed in the golden light of crystal and brass, Tom couldn't help but feel that this particular evening at Ambrosia might hold more than just a simple dinner. Caroline Montgomery had been watching from across the dining room when she saw Sandra, the junior waitress, start moving toward the entrance. With practiced efficiency, Caroline intercepted her younger colleague before she could reach the casually dressed man standing in the foyer. "I'll handle this one," she murmured, smoothing her already perfect uniform. 15 years at Ambrosia had taught her exactly how to maintain the standards this establishment demanded. Her steel-gray hair was pulled back in an immaculate French twist, not a single strand daring to escape. She wore her crisp black uniform like armor, the golden senior server pin on her lapel, a badge of honor earned through years of careful cultivation of the right kind of clientele. As she approached the man in the navy polo shirt, Caroline's practiced eye cataloged every detail that marked him as out of place in her domain. No watch, she noted. Weathered boat shoes, not even a sport coat. Her lips tightened into a thin line. Another one of those people who wandered in off the street, not understanding that Ambrosia was more than just a restaurant. It was an institution. She glanced around her section, noting with approval the Cartier watches, Hermès bags, and bespoke suits that adorned her current guests. Each table setting was a masterpiece of precision, crystal stemware catching the light at identical angles, silver placed exactly 1 inch from the edge of the custom-made tablecloths, and napkins folded into crisp, elegant shapes that would please even the most discerning guests. Caroline had memorized the invisible hierarchy of Ambrosia's seating chart: window tables for regulars, central tables for the obviously wealthy, and the less desirable spots near the kitchen for others. She'd developed an expert eye for quality over the years, taking pride in her ability to distinguish the truly wealthy from those merely playing dress-up. It was her unofficial duty, she believed, to protect Ambrosia's reputation from those who might diminish its prestige. As she drew closer to the man, she began formulating her approach. She had perfected subtle techniques over the years for encouraging unsuitable guests to dine elsewhere. A practiced smile touched her lips as she prepared to handle what she saw as yet another threat to Ambrosia's standards, unaware that her carefully maintained world was about to be shaken to its core. "Good evening." Caroline's voice carried the precise mix of politeness and frost she'd cultivated over years of managing unwanted guests. "I'm afraid there might be some confusion. This is Ambrosia." She emphasized the name as if speaking to someone who had accidentally wandered into a palace. Tom's warm smile remained unchanged. "Yes, it is. Beautiful evening, isn't it?" Caroline's eyebrows arched slightly at his casual response. She glanced pointedly at his polo shirt, then back to his face. "Sir, we maintain certain standards here at Ambrosia. Perhaps I could recommend several other establishments in the area that might be more—" She paused deliberately. "Suitable for your current attire?" "Actually," Tom replied gently, "I was hoping to have dinner here tonight. It's been a long day, and I've heard wonderful things about your new chef's tasting menu." Caroline's lips thinned as she moved to the reservation podium, her fingers dancing across the tablet with exaggerated precision. "I assume you have a reservation?" The question dripped with certainty that he didn't. "No reservation," Tom admitted, his eyes crinkling with amusement. "I was hoping you might have a table available." "I see." Caroline drew out the words like silk being pulled through fingers. "Unfortunately, we are quite fully committed this evening." She gestured vaguely at the half-empty dining room behind her. "We maintain an exclusive reservation system for our regular clientele." Tom nodded thoughtfully, glancing around at the numerous empty tables. "Perhaps just a spot at the bar, then? I'd hate to miss out on trying those duck confit spring rolls I've heard so much about." Caroline's spine stiffened at his persistence. In 15 years, she'd never failed to deflect an unsuitable guest. "Sir, even our bar seating is reserved for patrons who—" She gestured vaguely at his casual attire. "Understand our establishment's reputation for refinement. I really must insist that you try the bistro 3 blocks down. They have a much more relaxed atmosphere." Throughout her carefully crafted dismissal, Tom's expression remained genuinely pleasant, touched with something that might have been understanding. It was this very pleasantness that began to chip away at Caroline's usually unshakable composure. Most people would have shown anger by now, or embarrassment, or at least irritation. But this man's warmth remained steady, like a candle that refused to flicker in the wind of her disdain. "I appreciate your concern for the restaurant's standards," he said softly. "But if you could check again, I believe you might be able to find space for one more guest tonight." Something in his quiet confidence made Caroline's certainty waver for the first time that evening. She found herself reaching for the tablet again, though she knew exactly what it would show. Or, at least, she thought she did. Caroline's fingers hovered over the tablet for a moment before she straightened, masking her brief uncertainty with a tight smile. "Well," she said, her voice carrying a note of artificial brightness, "it appears we might be able to accommodate you after all, if you'll follow me." She turned sharply on her heel, not bothering to check if Tom was following, as she led him through the restaurant. They passed table after table of prime seating, the soft-lit window spots, the intimate corner booths, the elegant center tables beneath the crystal chandeliers. Caroline's path took them deeper into the restaurant, past the curved marble bar, beyond the realm of refined conversation and tinkling glasses. The elegant symphony of the main dining room gradually gave way to a more chaotic orchestra. The clatter of dishes from the kitchen, the hiss of steam, the sharp calls of behind and corner from hurrying staff. The lighting here was harsh and uneven, creating shadows that danced across the walls like restless spirits. "Here we are," Caroline announced with false cheerfulness, stopping at a small table wedged between a service station and the swinging kitchen doors. A single flickering overhead light cast an unflattering yellow glow across the tablecloth, which, while technically as pristine as those in the main dining room, somehow seemed sadder in this forgotten corner. "I'm sure you'll find this quite cozy," she added, watching Tom's face for any sign of discomfort or protest. A particularly loud crash from the kitchen punctuated her words, followed by a burst of rapid-fire Spanish from the dish pit. Tom pulled out the chair and settled himself with the same easy grace he'd shown at the entrance. "Thank you," he said genuinely, smoothing his napkin across his lap. "It's certainly an interesting vantage point of the restaurant's operations." His continued pleasantness only seemed to sharpen Caroline's desire to assert her authority. "We normally reserve this table for our more—" She paused, eyes flicking meaningfully to his polo shirt. "Spontaneous guests, I'm sure you understand." She placed a menu before him with practiced precision, though not before making a show of wiping it clean with her apron. "Our sommelier typically assists with wine selections," she added with a thin smile. "But given the circumstances, perhaps you'd prefer to start with our beer list. We do keep a few domestic options for occasions such as this." A busboy hurried past with a bin of dishes, the edge of his tray nearly grazing Tom's shoulder. Caroline made no move to intervene or apologize, instead allowing a small, satisfied smile to play across her lips. "I'll give you a moment to acclimate," she said, adding under her breath as she turned away, "though I can't imagine you'll stay long enough to need it." As she walked away, the kitchen doors swung open again, releasing a blast of hot air and the sharp scent of garlic. Tom sat quietly in his corner, watching the controlled chaos around him with genuine interest, seemingly unperturbed by either his surroundings or Caroline's thinly veiled contempt. There was something about his calm acceptance that made Caroline glance back over her shoulder, a tiny seed of unease beginning to take root beneath her certainty. Caroline allowed Tom exactly 7 minutes, long enough, she was certain, for the kitchen noise and harsh lighting to drive him toward the exit. When he remained seated, calmly reviewing the menu, she drew herself up and returned to his table, notepad poised like a shield. "Have you managed to navigate our menu?" she asked, emphasizing each word as if speaking to someone who might struggle with French cuisine. "I'd be happy to explain any terms you find challenging." Tom looked up with that same warm smile that had begun to unsettle her. "Actually, I believe I'll try the menu dégustation Grand Prestige with the accord mets et vins d'exception," he said, his pronunciation flowing with natural ease. The French phrases rolled off his tongue as smoothly as if he'd spent years in Paris. Caroline's eyebrows arched so high they nearly disappeared into her hairline. "The grand tasting menu?" She tapped her pen against the notepad. "Perhaps I should mention that it's our most exclusive offering, 7 courses, each with a carefully curated wine pairing. The experience runs," she paused for emphasis, $1,200 per person." "Yes, I heard the autumn truffle course is exceptional this year," Tom replied, closing the menu and handing it back to her. "And I've always appreciated Chef Marcus's innovative approach to classical French techniques." Caroline's fingers tightened around her pen. "Sir, this isn't your typical—" She searched for words that wouldn't be too blatantly condescending. "Casual dining experience. Each course is a carefully orchestrated presentation of the finest ingredients. The wine pairings alone include vintages that—" She lowered her voice. "Cost more than that shirt you're wearing." A particularly loud clang from the kitchen punctuated her words, but Tom remained unruffled. "That sounds wonderful," he said. "I especially look forward to the 1982 Chateau Lafite Rothschild with the Wagyu course. I remember when they first added that pairing to the menu. It was inspired." Caroline's practiced composure faltered for a moment. His knowledge of the wine list was unexpected, but she quickly recovered. "Well, if you're quite certain you understand what you're ordering." She let the sentence hang in the air like a doubting parent addressing a child's ambitious request. "I am, thank you," Tom replied simply. "Though I would appreciate your recommendation on whether to start with the champagne service or move directly to the first course." Standing in the harsh fluorescent light of the kitchen corridor, Caroline found herself caught between her certainty that this casually dressed man didn't belong and the growing evidence that he knew far more about fine dining than she'd assumed. The sound of swinging kitchen doors behind her seemed to echo her swinging certainty. She cleared her throat. "I'll inform the sommelier of your selection." She turned sharply, then added over her shoulder, "Though I should warn you, we do require all bills to be settled in full at the end of the meal." As she walked away, Caroline didn't see Tom's slight smile or the way he glanced at the elegant watch he'd slipped into his pocket earlier that evening, a watch that, had she seen it, she might have recognized as being worth more than her yearly salary. 20 minutes passed before the sommelier appeared at Tom's table, apologizing profusely for the delay. "I'm so sorry, sir. I was only just informed of your wine selection." He shot a questioning look toward Caroline, who was deliberately arranging flowers at a nearby table, her back turned to her neglected guest. "No worries at all," Tom replied, his warmth genuine. "I'm in no rush." Caroline's shoulders stiffened at his gracious response. After the sommelier departed, she made a show of attending to every other table in her section, topped water glasses that were still nearly full, and even stopped to chat with regular customers about their recent vacations in Provence. An elderly couple at a window table began to notice, their eyes tracking Caroline's obvious avoidance of the corner table. The woman leaned over to whisper something to her husband, her expression troubled, as she watched Tom sitting patiently in the harsh kitchen lighting. "Caroline?" A young woman at a nearby table tried to catch her attention, glancing meaningfully toward Tom's table. "I think that gentleman might be ready for his first course." "When I have a moment," Caroline replied airily, continuing to fold napkins that were already perfect. "We have many valued regular customers to attend to first." 45 minutes after placing his order, Tom's table remained empty, save for a water glass that hadn't been refilled since he sat down. The kitchen doors had swung open and closed countless times, each time releasing the aroma of expertly prepared dishes that were being served to other guests. A businessman in an expensive suit, seated with his wife at one of the prime tables, began to frown as he observed Caroline's behavior. "Darling," his wife murmured, "isn't that—" But Caroline had already swept past their table, cutting off the conversation as she made yet another unnecessary adjustment to the flower arrangements. She could feel the weight of disapproving glances from her other tables, but her pride wouldn't allow her to acknowledge her own unprofessional conduct. A junior server approached her tentatively. "Ms. Montgomery, Chef Marcus is asking about the timing for Table 14's tasting menu." "Chef Marcus understands that we have a proper order to things here," Caroline snapped, though her voice carried a hint of defensive edge that hadn't been there before. She could feel her carefully maintained authority beginning to slip as more diners turned their attention to the situation unfolding in the corner. Through it all, Tom sat quietly, occasionally glancing around with genuine interest at the restaurant's operations. His calm demeanor only seemed to fuel Caroline's determination to make him uncomfortable enough to leave. She didn't notice the maitre d' beginning to make his way across the dining room, his expression grave as he observed the growing tension in his usually smooth-running establishment. A distinguished-looking couple at the adjacent table exchanged glances before the woman whispered, "I can't believe how she's treating him. Should we say something to management?" Her companion shook his head slightly, a knowing smile playing at his lips. "I don't think that will be necessary. If that's who I think it is—" The chaos of the kitchen corridor couldn't mask the murmurs of disapproval that were beginning to ripple through the dining room. Caroline's world of precise control was unraveling thread by thread, but like a captain going down with her ship, she seemed determined to maintain her course, even as the waters of propriety closed in around her. The elderly gentleman who had been observing the situation from the window table finally set down his napkin with deliberate care. His wife gave his hand a gentle squeeze of encouragement as he rose from his seat, straightening his suit jacket. "My dear," he said softly to his wife, "some things simply cannot be ignored." With the dignity of his years about him, he made his way through the dining room, navigating between tables with measured steps. Caroline, who was still making a show of reorganizing the service station, froze when she noticed his approach toward the kitchen corridor. "Good evening," the gentleman said warmly, stopping at Tom's table. His voice carried the cultivated tone of old money and good breeding. "I'm Edward Blackwood. My wife, Margaret, and I have been dining at Ambrosia for over 30 years. Tom stood to shake his hand, that same genuine smile brightening his face. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Blackwood. Please, join me for a moment?" Caroline hovered nearby, suddenly uncertain. Edward Blackwood was one of Ambrosia's most respected patrons, and his opinion carried significant weight with management. "I must say," Edward continued, settling into the offered chair, "I've been watching your situation with growing concern. In all my years dining here, I've never witnessed such a—" He paused, glancing pointedly at Caroline. "Departure from the standards of service this establishment was built upon." Tom's eyes crinkled with warmth. "Sometimes people have bad days. I try not to take it personally." "Your composure is admirable," Edward replied, his voice carrying clearly to nearby tables. "Though I fear it's being quite thoroughly tested this evening." He turned slightly toward Caroline, who was now pretending to polish already gleaming glasses. "Young lady, I believe this gentleman's water glass needs refreshing, and unless I'm mistaken, his first course is now nearly an hour overdue." Caroline's face flushed as other diners nodded in agreement. The businessman and his wife from the prime table had stopped eating to watch the scene unfold. "Your patience," Edward continued, turning back to Tom, "reminds me of a story about my old friend William, who built this restaurant from nothing. He used to say that true character isn't revealed by how we treat those we think important, but by how we treat those we think aren't." He smiled knowingly. "Though sometimes, of course, those two categories have a way of surprising us." Tom's eyes twinkled with appreciation for the gentleman's wisdom. "Your friend William sounds like a remarkable man." "Oh, he was," Edward agreed, standing slowly. "And I believe he would have been quite impressed by your grace this evening." He straightened his jacket again, then added in a carrying voice, "Though perhaps less impressed by how far certain standards have slipped." As Edward made his way back to his table, the weight of the dining room's attention settled heavily on Caroline's shoulders. She stood frozen by the service station, her carefully constructed world of judgment and authority crumbling beneath the quiet dignity of the exchange she had just witnessed. The maitre d' who had been observing the situation finally approached Tom's table, his face drawn with concern. Behind him walked James Chen, Ambrosia's manager, who had just emerged from his office after being quietly summoned by several concerned staff members. "I do apologize for the delay in your sir," James began, then stopped abruptly. The color drained from his face as recognition dawned. "Mr. Hanks? Oh my God, Tom." The quiet buzz of conversation in the dining room suddenly ceased. Caroline, who had been half-heartedly approaching with a water pitcher at Edward Blackwood's prompting, nearly dropped it. The crystal decanter wobbled precariously in her trembling hands. "Hello, James," Tom replied warmly, standing to shake the manager's hand. "I was hoping to have a quiet dinner and see how things were running from a guest's perspective." His eyes crinkled with that same gentle smile he'd maintained all evening. "I have to say it's been quite educational." James looked mortified as he glanced from Tom's empty table to Caroline's frozen figure. "Mr. Hanks, I cannot express how deeply sorry I am for this evening's service. Had I known one of our principal owners was dining with us, then it would have defeated the purpose of my casual attire," Tom finished kindly. He retrieved his watch from his pocket, a vintage Patek Philippe that Caroline now recognized with horror, and checked the time. "Though I must say, 90 minutes is quite a wait for the first course of our tasting menu." The sound Caroline made might have been a whimper. Throughout the dining room, expressions of shock and recognition rippled across the faces of the other patrons. The businessman's wife, who had tried to point out Tom's identity earlier, whispered an "I told you so" to her husband. "Caroline," James said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, "please explain why you seated Mr. Hanks, one of Ambrosia's founding partners, at the kitchen service table, and then proceeded to ignore his order for over an hour." Caroline's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Her perfectly maintained composure crumbled like a house of cards in a storm. The golden senior server pin on her lapel seemed to mock her as the weight of her monumental error pressed down upon her shoulders. "Now, James," Tom interjected gently, "I'm sure Caroline was simply trying to maintain the high standards Ambrosia is known for." His words carried no trace of sarcasm, though they struck home with devastating effect. "Though perhaps we should revisit how those standards are being interpreted." The elderly Mrs. Blackwood, still seated at her window table, didn't bother to hide her satisfied smile as she watched Caroline's carefully constructed world of judgment and superiority collapse around her. Throughout the dining room, guests who had witnessed the evening's events exchanged knowing looks, some shaking their heads at the irony of it all. James began rapidly giving instructions to his staff, trying to salvage what remained of the evening, but Tom raised a hand to pause him. The simple gesture immediately commanded the attention of everyone in the room. Caroline stood rooted to the spot, her face a mask of mortification, as she realized that for the past 90 minutes she had been condescending to, ignoring, and actively disrespecting not just any guest, but Tom Hanks, acclaimed actor, philanthropist, and, as she was now learning to her horror, one of the very people who signed her paychecks. As the last customers departed Ambrosia that evening, the usual bustling energy of closing time was replaced by an unusual tension. The staff gathered in the main dining room, their eyes darting between Caroline, who stood apart from the group, her earlier confidence now a distant memory, and Tom, who had remained at his corner table through the remainder of service, quietly observing the restaurant's operations. "Please, everyone, sit down," Tom said warmly, gesturing to the empty chairs around him. The staff hesitated until James nodded his encouragement, and they slowly began taking seats at the surrounding tables. The crystal chandeliers cast a softer glow now, their light gentler without the pressure of service hours. "First," Tom began, his voice carrying easily through the quiet room, "I want to thank you all for the incredible work you do here every night. Ambrosia isn't just a restaurant. It's a place where memories are made, where people celebrate their most precious moments." He paused, his eyes scanning the faces around him. "But tonight, I experienced something that made me realize we need to have an important conversation." Caroline shifted uncomfortably in her chair, but Tom's next words surprised everyone. "And I want to thank Caroline for helping me understand something we've been missing." Her head snapped up, eyes wide with confusion. "You see," Tom continued, leaning forward slightly, "Caroline's actions tonight weren't entirely her fault. They were the natural result of a culture that we, as owners, allowed to develop, one where the trappings of wealth became more important than the essence of hospitality." He stood and walked to the center of the room, his casual polo shirt now seeming less out of place and more like a purposeful choice. "When William and I founded this restaurant, we had a simple vision: to create a place where every guest would feel like the most important person in the room, regardless of what they were wearing or how much money they appeared to have." The younger servers exchanged glances as Tom continued. "True luxury isn't about crystal stemware or expensive wines. It's about how we make people feel. Every person who walks through those doors carries their own story, their own dignity. Our job isn't to judge those stories. It's to add a beautiful chapter to them." He turned to Caroline, his expression gentle. "When you seated me by the kitchen, treated me with disdain, and made me wait, you taught me something valuable. You showed me that we've drifted from our original purpose. But you also showed me your dedication to maintaining what you believed were Ambrosia's standards. That dedication isn't wrong. It's just been misdirected." Several staff members nodded slowly, some wiping away tears as Tom's words resonated with their own experiences. A young busboy who had often been on the receiving end of Caroline's sharp corrections sat up straighter, his expression thoughtful. "Starting tomorrow," Tom announced, "we're implementing some changes. Every staff member will spend one shift each month dining in our restaurant, dressed however they choose. Some of you will be seated in the prime spots, others by the kitchen, but all of you will experience what it feels like to be on the other side of service." He smiled at the ripple of surprised murmurs. "Because at the end of the day, this isn't about Caroline, or me, or any individual. It's about remembering that every single person who walks through our doors deserves to be treated with the same respect, dignity, and kindness that we'd show to a beloved family member." Caroline's eyes glistened with tears as Tom approached her. "I believe you have the potential to be an incredible leader here, Caroline. Not because you can maintain the highest standards of service, which you clearly can, but because you now understand firsthand how it feels when those standards are applied without humanity." As his words settled over the room, the staff seemed to collectively exhale, as if a weight they hadn't known they were carrying had been lifted. The kitchen porter, who had been afraid to make eye contact with Caroline for years, found himself sharing a meaningful glance with her. The junior server, who had tried to remind her about Tom's order, sat up straighter, feeling validated. "Now," Tom concluded with a warm smile, "I believe Chef Marcus has prepared a late staff dinner for us all. And yes, Caroline," he added kindly, "you'll be sitting right here next to me. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we can make Ambrosia not just the most exclusive restaurant in Manhattan, but also the most welcoming." After the staff meeting, as others filed toward the kitchen for dinner, Caroline lingered behind, her hands trembling slightly as she removed the golden senior server pin from her lapel. "Mr. Hanks," she said softly, holding out the pin, "I don't deserve to wear this anymore." Tom gently closed her fingers back around the pin. "Keep it, Caroline. Let it remind you not of authority, but of the responsibility we have to make others feel valued." Tears spilled down her cheeks, smudging her perfect makeup. "I've spent so many years judging people, thinking I was maintaining standards, when really I was just—" She stopped, her voice breaking. "I was cruel." "Recognition is the first step toward change," Tom replied kindly. "The real test isn't in grand gestures, but in the small kindnesses we choose to show each day." Caroline straightened her shoulders, wiping her eyes. "I promise you, I'll do better. Not just because you're an owner, but because—" She looked around the elegant dining room, seeing it with new eyes. "Because every person who walks through that door deserves to feel special." Tom smiled, that same warm smile that had unsettled her earlier, now bringing her comfort. "Then, you haven't just learned a lesson, Caroline. You've learned the very heart of hospitality." As Tom stepped out of Ambrosia into the cool Manhattan night, he paused to look back at the elegant facade. Through the windows, he could see Caroline earnestly speaking with the young busboy she had once dismissed, sharing a plate of Chef Marcus's staff dinner. He smiled, remembering his friend William's words when they first opened the restaurant. We're not in the business of serving food, we're in the business of serving humanity. Tonight had proved that sometimes the greatest transformations come not from confrontation, but from meeting judgment with kindness, prejudice with patience, and arrogance with humility. In Caroline's tears, he had seen not just regret, but the spark of real change. As his car pulled up to the curb, Tom thought about the polo shirt he wore, a simple choice that had revealed so much. In the end, the true measure of a person lay not in their appearance or position, but in how they treated others in their moments of power. He had come to inspect his restaurant, but had ended up witnessing something far more valuable. The moment when one heart opened to the possibility of change, proving that kindness, even in the face of disdain, held the power to transform not just moments, but lives.